I'm very excited to invite to the podium our next speaker and my interviewee, Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt. Please, thank you. Nigel, okay. That was going to be my first question for you.
Just Nigel.
How do I address? I've never interviewed a knight before. So, all right. Well, thank you. So let me. But even then, let me give everybody a very, very summarized introduction of Nigel. He is principal of Jesus College in Oxford, professorial research fellow in the CS department at Oxford as well, chairman of the Open Data Institute, which he co-founded with Tim Berners-Lee, and a very interdisciplinary researcher and policy expert. His research focuses on understanding how intelligent behavior is embodied and emerges in humans, machines, and most recently on the web. And he has made contributions to the fields of psychology, cognitive science, computational neuroscience, AI, computer science, and the emerging field of web science. Thank you for joining us. I am very, very excited. So, Nigel and I met not too long ago in Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually. Before I moved, I was like, I am going to move to London, and we should follow up when I'm there. So here he is. One of the things I didn't say is that you are you were the leader of a new institute at the University of Oxford focused on AI ethics. And so there was a lot of press coverage about this. And I was very excited that this was about to happen. Can you tell us a little bit more about the motivation behind the Institute? And also, why do you think this kind of work is needed right now?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, a couple of things, probably just for the record, is that this was off the back of a very significant donation from Stephen Schwarzman, who gave £150 million to Oxford to establish a new humanities centre. Now, some people, in reading that and the excitement around the announcement and Stephen's own excitement around AI ethics, just imagine that was all for AI ethics. And no, it isn't. It's for a very large building which will integrate and house a whole range of faculties from within the humanities. So but the exciting thing about the significant but minority amount of support out of that gift to Oxford is for this Institute for Ethics in AI, which will be located in the department or the Faculty of Philosophy. Now, that's a little bit different than some models. There are a lot of ethics, codes, activities around. I think the feeling was that we wanted it to be distinctive in Oxford by locating it in a world-class philosophy faculty with a tradition of practical ethics. And if you think back historically, people like R.M. Hare, people like Derek Parfit on What Matters, Mary Warnock, Iris Murdoch, all philosophers of that Oxford tradition. And the distinctive feature of that was deep thinking about the value systems and the ethical systems, the meta-ethics, the issues around which you needed to get a real grip to intercept challenging problems of the time. And I think that was that feature, of course, locating it within philosophy. The whole idea is that Oxford's a very unique kind of institutional structure. It's a little bit like the web. You know, it comprises 38 colleges that all have a kind of autonomous status that collectively form the Collegiate University of Oxford. There are departments, there are divisions, there are faculties. Actually, it's a bit like the web. You know, it's very decentralized and it can root round failure and success sometimes, I should say, and has a collective action problem sometimes. But it's a wonderful institution because it allows for a huge remixing of subject areas. But within that distributed architecture, we have departments, computer science, information engineering. We have the Big Data Institute in the life sciences, in the medical division. We have the HERA's Centre for Practical Ethics. We have the Wellcome Centre for Ethics. We have the Oxford Internet Institute, we have the Blavatnik School of Government. There are all of these centres within which there are people working on knotty issues around the application, the development of the technology, or its application into significant use context. So philosophy will be the kind of centroid for this, but it'll be reaching out to all of these other departments with joint appointments. So there's, I'm actually at this point leading the initiation, because that building won't actually get the ribbon cut for 4 or 5 years, but we'll be appointing staff to the institute right now. So we'll be looking for a director, 5 professorial posts, a bunch of postdoctoral appointments, a bunch of PhD or DPhils we call them in Oxford. So there'll be a whole bunch of recruitment going on and activity to convene the ethical work across Oxford, and then to intersect that with just the huge range of activity that we see in the AI landscape at the moment. And that's something we might talk about, because there are a lot of initiatives. I think somebody counted, I've seen lists that go from 80 to 100 plus, right? Codes and efforts and initiatives. And I have to say there's probably quite a lot of virtue signaling in all of that. The question is, where will the important work land, and how can we ensure we can help really make progress?
I have so many questions just following that introduction. So you were talking about the tradition of applied ethics and also the joint affiliations of faculty. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And so I'm imagining, obviously, there will be a lot of collaboration between, say, the computer science department and the institute. What other areas and how do you see this working, and what does it say about applied, the piece about applied?
Well, certainly joint appointments across philosophy and computer science. There's a general sense in which we look to the emergence of medical ethics as quite an interesting analogy. If you look back to that discipline, I mean, medical ethics is a thing. People imagine it must have always been around, but there wasn't such a thing as informed consent until a number of decades ago. When you look at the establishment of a journal in the field of medical ethics, initially there weren't philosophers who worked on medical ethics. What there was initially were philosophers who got very engaged with the issues of how you could bring the practice of medicine, not just under an interesting degree of ethical scrutiny. Of course, interestingly, as a licensed profession, there'd always been the Hippocratic Oath, there'd been various forms of observance of behavior, but this was much more interesting. This was when you had philosophers who were initially people working in the philosophy of language, or epistemologists working in the area of what we can know and how certainly we can know these things. People from metaphysics, people who were ethicists thinking, what is distinctive about medicine? How does that challenge us? And so some of the early work was clearing the ground on key concepts in the field. It was understanding where issues of equity might arise in making medical decisions, how you allocated technology or therapy to particular groups. So there are a lot of resonances. There were concepts that had to be developed most recently, things like brain death, actual, or notions like mental integrity, the actual notion that physical integrity, that you have rights as an individual to assume that your body or your mind will not be invaded in various ways. Having said all of that, there's also the notion of balancing that off against the patient's interests or society's wider interests. So there are very interesting analogies in looking at the evolution of a field like that, where the philosophical thinking that happened has become really material. So when you see a huge issue in the field, such as acute care for dreadfully ill, very young babies, at what point does the concept of futility kick in? At what point is it moral or ethical to refrain from treatment? And these are very difficult questions. And the other interesting aspect that we learned from that, and actually one of our great philosophers, Mary Warnock, took the lead on this. She chaired a thing in the 80s called the Human Embryology and Fertilization Review. The Warnock Review was trying to work out how, in the face of this extraordinary set of developments in life science around reproductive medicine, how would we as a society make judgments about that technology? Assembled a range of stakeholders from philosophy, from from the public, from policymakers, from philosophers, from faith-based groups, to try and come to a notion of what could be acceptable. Where could we do research, for example, on embryos, or how would we go forward with fertilization work? And really important results came out of that, practical guidance that most people would suggest nowadays allowed us to do permissive research with the support of the broader public to generate reasonably good results for society and not end up in a complete moral deadlock around some of these questions.
So it's really interesting you say, things like the definition of death, some of the very basic concepts. One of the parallels that I'm thinking about, keeping within the proportions, we're not talking about death, but fairness. Right? So machine learning fairness, it's an incredibly active area of research right now, very important. And yet, a lot of the conversation, or at least recently, has been about how when you talk about machine learning fairness, you are, from a computer science point of view, you are invariably talking about data, distribution, biased data, different skewed distributions, if you will, and thresholds, right? And deciding on trade-offs for fairness from that point of view. And yet the criticism has been, well, but those notions leave out societal notions of social justice, historical oppression. And so how do we bridge that? And is part of what the parallel, I guess, back to medical, do we as a society need new definitions that we never had to confront before?
That's a great question. I think we will find parallels. I think we'll also, it's very interesting you referenced the boundary objects. I remember when I was, I've been working in AI for far too many years, but when I was setting up after leaving Edinburgh, my first group was in the Department of Psychology at Nottingham. And there we had a researcher called John Bowers. John Bowers kind of introduced me to the notion of boundary objects working within HCI in the 90s. And it was just at that time we had a whole move of that era of the great and the good in AI, looking at their rule-based systems and their logicist approaches to AI and thinking, we need to get down and do some serious ethno-methodology. We need to, so people like Clancy and people like Winograd were suddenly saying, we've just got to kind of locate this stuff in a much deeper embedding. Lucy Suchman with her work around situated action, really different philosophical formulation. I think what we seek sometimes is that with the enthusiasm, with the generational shift to a new set of technology, a new set of grad students, there's kind of a feeling that, wow, we've never had these problems before. They're exactly the same problem when we're trying to struggle with how do we make sense of its genetic algorithms output? What the hell do we do with the contextual and relevance of a rule-based medical system, which has got a bunch of knowledge taken from a bunch of experts who may or may not be subject to various forms of bias or preference. Because now we work at a scale that is quite extraordinary with very powerful and interesting methods. But the questions are very self-similar. And again, I was very struck by the notion that we can find analogues. I was privileged to hear Alondra Nelson talking in Oxford last night about her work in genomics and how the challenges of customized genomic testing throws up a whole bunch of challenges around what's equitable. That wonderful judgment that was given in that field about, I have my DNA sequenced, it's not yours to give, says one set of people, because it has all sorts of spillover effects. Well, those are genuinely, it's not stopping huge amounts of deployment of this technology. Is it licensed as medical tests? Sometimes is, sometimes isn't. There are lots of associated issues that I think we can learn from. We will have our own problems in this area, and I think fairness, equity, the issue about where the balance of interests sit, what that broader embedding looks like, that's why philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, the kind of people you're trying to convene here, that's why it's so important and so exciting to get ourselves out from inside our absolute fascination, and quite rightly in some respects, in awe of the kind of weight matrices we build. What are we going to do with this? In whose interest is it being deployed?
Great. Let me see. I want to make sure I get. Oh, yeah. So on that, you bring up the example of genomic technology. I guess one question I would have is. Within the medical field, within genomics, it seems like, but tell me if you disagree, it seems like we're still talking potentially about a discipline. Mm. And so when we're talking about AI ethics, we're talking about a set of technologies that will be used and is already being used to power a whole range of disciplines, if you will, right, of human endeavors. So we have healthcare, we have potentially criminal justice, we have things like artistic creation, music, copyright. And so it's mind-boggling the number and the variety of human endeavors that AI is starting to power and can power even more in the future. So I guess part of my question is, how do we think about an AI, an ethical framework that is not specific to a domain within its contexts and within its circumstances, but it's really like, it could be underlying many different human contexts?
I mean, that is clearly the case. You have this extraordinary, almost transverse kind of capability. Almost every domain it could be applied to. Of course, in some sense, that's a little bit similar with genomics, which is now applied in forensic contexts. It's applied in insurance contexts. It's applied in directly medical contexts. So the actual application of the technique.
Can you talk a little bit about that, about what transfers and how it transfers?
In the AI context, I think that's the challenge for us, because people say, well, we need some limitation characteristics. People say, is it like nuclear or chemical or biological? And well, of course, in a sense, because this is existential, but actually those methods, those insights, those sciences were in some sense more capable of being scrutinized, more capable of being, the limitation treaty, the non-proliferation, the ability to notice whether it's being used at all, the resources required. So AI and advanced computing has this extraordinarily broad base. So it actually has characteristics that make it, I think, substantially harder, but it shouldn't be a counsel of despair. So what would we look for? I think we have to, again, take approaches which have been thought about in other domains when people have thought about social and responsible innovation in the past. Asking themselves, well, what are the fundamental concepts we want to attend to? So you talk about fairness or equity. Whose fairness are we talking about? Whose perspective have we introduced here? Is there a collective good that is being represented as well as an individual good? Is there something that we have to think about in terms of self-denial of some aspects of the insights, or just because we can make the inferences doesn't mean that we can put them to use in decision-making. Actually, we've got lots of laws like that, for example, already in the world, where just because I know your age, I can't make a judgment about employment based on it, or your ethnicity, or whatever. So we kind of do have the beginnings of frameworks here, but the challenge in AI is its sheer breadth. So will we purpose limit by domain? Would it be better to understand these fundamental attributes across the piece? So when you talk about fairness, or when we talk about explicability, how method dependent is that? How sector dependent is that? And that's the work we need to do. And it will be it'll be tough, because it will be differently faceted in different domains. And so if I'm thinking about it in terms of possibly credit ratings, do I really understand the social consequences of that across the piece? And am I really then clear in my mind about the key characteristics I want from the data or the nature of the explanation? Yeah. So.
Okay. How are we doing on time?
I'm having fun, so I'm sure we must be chewing up the time.
Okay. No. This is good. So one of the things that going back a little bit to fairness, one of the things that I'm always curious about is technology obviously does not answer all these questions. That's why we need to be thinking about these questions from a number of aspects. Can technology help us get better conversations and potentially get to an interesting solution? I'll explain what I mean by that. I think we're in a point where, because of these AI systems, we are having to deal with questions that we haven't had to deal with so explicitly with before, fairness being one of them. And I wonder if that shouldn't be a welcome catalyst to be having that kind of conversation at a much higher level, and not expecting that the technology is going to solve it, but really, because in the end, it's going to be back to values, to morals, and so how do you see technology helping, hindering, being a catalyst in making progress, I guess, in this area?
Well, I mean, it's back to values. So, and I think one thing that we will see in however the technology develops is context of deployment. We're starting to see it already, will be to some extent regionalized. So the fact is that here in the European Union, and I can still say that, we're developing a set of preferences or a set of potential remedies, or which are interesting. They're about self-determination, dignity, autonomy. They're around issues that sound a little bit Enlightenment-like. They're around also understanding the benefits to collective social good. Now, that context may be very different than a context where there's a different sort of valuation of principles that you might find in other parts of the globe. And you might find various neoliberal interpretations that are very different in terms of the things that are preferred, would see this as overmighty regulation. So when you have a commissioner like Margrethe Vestager, you've got a really interesting sense in which regulation is going to also impact with your values. And how does this play out in terms of technology? Well, that seems to me exactly the point of convening these kinds of conversations, these kinds of workshops, these kind of great groups, because your technology, you might want to pretend it's deeply value neutral, but ultimately it will play out in a value-laden context. And I think the best we can do, and I think that the methods we are developing do allow us to see in a different way, as you present, high-dimensional data sets, which are emerging in ways we had not seen before. What are they telling us about the distribution of attributes across a demography? Is that the question we want to ask? Do I as an individual care about that, or do I care about the particular view it has of me as an individual? Do I want an explanation for my system that is based on statistics, is based on cases like me, is based on some kind of proposed walkthrough of how the decision-making happened? That all of that also sits in a context of what do I reasonably expect, and what does my current place of origin reasonably allow me to do to seek insight and empowerment from these wonderful technologies.
My last question. So it occurred to me that what we're trying to do here today, in bringing these different disciplines and professionals and perspectives, is maybe a tiny bit related to what you will be doing in Oxford, bringing together the different departments to be thinking together about the ethical frameworks around AI. I'm very curious, how much do the philosophers want to get into AI ethics at this point? And also the other way around, how do you see the engineers and the computer science, and which way do you think is harder?
That's interesting. Actually, we had a town meeting just this week where we didn't have enough seats in the lecture theatre. It's kind of interesting that there is a genuine, really deep interest from our colleagues around humanities. I mean, they see the great positive affirmation of the gift was that it is asking questions about what it is to be human in the 21st century. And humanities have always been about that question, whether it's literature or music or classics, or history, it's how do we make sense of ourselves? And with the new technologies we're building, we want to ask that question again. And I think that it's about the ethics of data, it's about the ethics of algorithms, it's about the ethics of its deployment and context. And so that's a conversation that's bigger than just Oxford. It's why I think it's a conversation we have to have nationally and internationally. We have to convene people to just really get into that. And I've, huge appetite within our students in the tech area too. We now run classes that are not just tokenist classes on Ethics 101 for engineers. It feels like it's really material because there they are building systems, and every day in the paper there is the application of an algorithm which has had consequences that, oh, that's interesting. There is an actually interesting ethical dimension to either the data that's being used, the algorithm method that's being used, its context of deployment, the kind of decisions it makes. And we're living with that on a daily basis.
Great. Thank you so much, Nigel. Let's thank our speakers.